The pool glowed like liquid obsidian, its surface catching the faint shimmer of stars above a sleepy San Francisco suburb. Eric's heart pounded so hard he swore it echoed off the water, each beat screaming a truth he'd buried for years. He stood at the edge, watching Caleb, his best friend, his untouchable crush, swim lazy laps, oblivious to the storm raging in Eric's chest. Eric, 25, had spent most of his life in the Bay Area, a place where fog clung to the hills like a lover's whisper. He was no stranger to longing, but Caleb was a different kind of ache. With his sharp jawline, easy laugh, and hazel eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds, Caleb was the kind of guy who could make anyone question their reality. They'd been inseparable since college, bonding over late-night study sessions and shared dreams of escaping their small-town roots. But Caleb had always been clear. He was straight. Unequivocally, proudly, frustratingly straight. Eric had accepted it, or so he thought. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air was thick with summer heat, and Caleb's parents' sprawling backyard, with its infinity pool and jasmine-scented breeze, felt like a stage set for something inevitable. Eric tugged at the hem of his white tank top, suddenly hyper-aware of the way it clung to his skin. He wasn't built like Caleb, whose broad shoulders and defined arms came from years of competitive swimming. But Eric had his own quiet charm, lean, with dark hair that fell just shy of his blue eyes, and a smile that disarmed even the coldest strangers. "Yo, you gonna stand there all night or get in?" Caleb called, his voice cutting through the stillness. He surfaced, shaking water from his chestnut hair, droplets catching the moonlight like tiny diamonds. His black sleeveless shirt was soaked, outlining every curve of his torso. Eric's throat tightened. "Give me a sec," Eric managed, kicking off his sneakers. He didn't trust his voice to stay steady. The truth, what he felt, what he'd always felt, was a weight he'd carried since the first time Caleb slung an arm around him during a drunken karaoke night 3 years ago. That casual touch had ignited something Eric couldn't extinguish. No matter how many times Caleb talked about his latest girlfriend or swore he'd never swing that way, Eric slid into the pool, the cool water a shock against his heated skin. Caleb swam closer, his grin playful but his eyes unreadable. "Race you to the other side," he said, already kicking off. Eric laughed, the sound masking the nervous flutter in his gut. They raced, splashing and shoving like kids, the tension momentarily forgotten. But when they reached the deep end, panting and laughing, Caleb didn't pull away. He stayed close, too close, his breath warm against Eric's cheek. "You're slow, man," Caleb teased, but his voice was softer now, almost intimate. Eric's pulse spiked. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but the words caught in his throat. Caleb's hand brushed his under the water, and for a fleeting second, Eric swore it lingered. The night stretched on, the two of them floating in the dark pool, talking about everything and nothing, college, dreams, the future. Caleb's stories were always bigger, bolder, like he was chasing a life too grand for their quiet town. Eric listened, captivated, but his mind kept circling back to that touch, that moment. Was it nothing? Was he imagining the way Caleb's gaze lingered a little too long? "I ever tell you about that summer in Santa Cruz?" Caleb said suddenly, his voice low. Eric shook his head, curious. Caleb's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the city lights flickered faintly. I met this guy at a bonfire. Artist type. Real free spirit. He tried to kiss me. Eric's heart stopped. What did you do? Caleb shrugged, but his expression was tight. Conflicted. Push him away. Told him I wasn't into guys. But he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the water. I don't know. Man, I keep thinking about it. Like, what if I hadn't? The confession hung between them, heavy and electric. Eric's mind raced. Was this real? Was Caleb, the guy who dated half the sorority in college, actually questioning himself? Eric wanted to ask, to push, but fear clamped his mouth shut. Instead, he forced a laugh. You just drunk on chlorine. Dude, Caleb didn't laugh. He looked at Eric, his hazel eyes searching, and for the first time, Eric saw something raw, unguarded. Maybe, Caleb said, but his voice was barely above a whisper. He swam closer, their knees brushing under the water. Eric's breath hitched, and he prayed Caleb couldn't hear the frantic thud of his heart. The moment stretched, fragile and infinite, until Caleb reached out, his hand grazing Eric's arm. It wasn't an accident this time. Eric froze, every nerve alight. Caleb's fingers lingered, tracing a slow path up to his shoulder, and Eric's world tilted. Caleb, he whispered, half warning, half plea. Don't, Caleb said, his voice rough. Just don't say anything. And then, in a move that shattered every wall Eric had built, Caleb leaned in, his lips brushing Eric's in a tentative, searching kiss. It was soft, uncertain, but it set Eric's blood on fire. He kissed back, desperate, pouring years of unspoken longing into that single moment. When they pulled apart, gasping, Caleb's eyes were wide, like he just crossed a line he hadn't known existed. I don't know what this means, he stammered, running a hand through his wet hair. Eric's chest ached, torn between hope and dread. He wanted to grab Caleb, to kiss him again, to demand answers. But all he could do was nod, his voice lost to the chaos in his head. They climbed out of the pool in silence, the night air cool against their skin. Caleb didn't look at him as they toweled off, but Eric could feel the weight of what had just happened. It was a beginning or an end. He wasn't sure which. As they walked back to the house, Caleb finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Don't tell anyone. Okay, I need time to figure this out. Eric nodded, his heart a tangled mess of joy and fear. Okay, he said, but inside, he was screaming. Caleb had kissed him. Caleb, who swore he was straight, had kissed him. And now, nothing would ever be the same. The days after the kiss were a blur of tension and stolen glances. Eric woke each morning with the memory of Caleb's lips on his, the taste of chlorine and something sweeter lingering like a ghost. But Caleb acted like nothing had happened, cracking jokes and talking about his new internship at a tech startup in Palo Alto as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis that night. Eric, meanwhile, was unraveling. He'd always been good at hiding his feelings, his fears, the truth of who he was. Growing up gay in a small town hadn't been easy, even in progressive California. He'd learned to keep his head down, to smile through the ache of unrequited crushes. But Caleb was different. Caleb was his best friend, The one person who made him feel seen. And now, after that kiss, Eric didn't know how to go back to pretending. They met up a week later at a coffee shop in the Mission District. The kind of place with exposed brick walls and baristas who looked like they moonlighted as indie musicians. Eric arrived early, nursing a latte and trying not to overthink the way Caleb's texts had been shorter. Clipped. Since the pool. When Caleb walked in, wearing a fitted gray hoodie and jeans that hugged his legs, Eric's stomach flipped. He looked good, too good, and the easy confidence in his stride only made Eric's nerves worse. "Hey," Caleb said, sliding into the seat across from him. His smile was tight, like he was trying too hard to seem normal. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare." "No worries," Eric said, his voice steadier than he felt. He wanted to ask about the kiss, to demand why Caleb was acting like it never happened, but the words stuck. Instead, they talked about safe things, work, the Warriors' latest game, a new sci-fi series on Netflix. But the air between them crackled with unspoken questions, and Eric caught Caleb's eyes darting to his lips more than once. Finally, Eric couldn't take it anymore. "Caleb," he said, leaning forward, his voice low. "We need to talk about what happened." Caleb's jaw tightened, and he looked away, out the window where pedestrians hurried through the afternoon drizzle. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was strained, like he was trying to convince himself. "Bullshit," Eric snapped, louder than he meant to. A few heads turned, and he lowered his voice. "You kissed me, Caleb. You can't just pretend it didn't happen." Caleb's eyes flicked back to him, wide and conflicted. "I was drunk," he said, but the excuse sounded hollow, and he knew it. "I don't know what I was thinking. Okay, it was a mistake." The word hit Eric like a punch. A mistake. He'd spent years dreaming of a moment like that, and now Caleb was calling it a mistake. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Was it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it didn't feel like a mistake to me." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "Eric, I'm not like you. I'm not gay. I got a life, a plan. I'm supposed to meet someone, settle down, have kids. That's who I am." Eric's heart sank, but he refused to let it show. "Then why'd you kiss me?" he pressed. "If you're so sure, why'd you do it?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He stared at his coffee, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "I don't know," he admitted finally. I saw you that night, and something clicked. I don't know what it means, and it's freaking me out." Eric wanted to reach across the table, to take Caleb's hand and tell him it was okay, that they could figure it out together. But the fear in Caleb's eyes stopped him. This wasn't just about a kiss. This was about Caleb confronting a part of himself he'd never acknowledged. And Eric knew how terrifying that could be. "Let's just take it slow," Eric said, his voice gentle. "You don't have to have all the answers right now." Caleb nodded, but his expression was guarded, like he was already building walls. They finished their coffee in silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on them. As they left the shop, Caleb bumped Eric's shoulder, a small gesture that felt like an apology. "I'm not running away," he said quietly. "I just need time." Eric nodded, his heart a battlefield of hope and doubt. "I'm here," he said, and he meant it. But as Caleb walked away, disappearing into the crowd, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that time might not be on their side. That night, Eric lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his tiny apartment. He replayed the kiss, Caleb's words, the way his hazel eyes had softened just before he pulled away. He wanted to believe Caleb would come around, that the kiss was the start of something real. But doubt gnawed at him. What if Caleb meant it? What if it really was a mistake? Weeks passed, and the distance between Eric and Caleb grew like a chasm. They still hung out, but it was different, strained, like they were both tiptoeing around a landmine. Eric tried to give Caleb space, to let him process whatever he was feeling, but the silence was torture. Every unanswered text, every canceled plan, felt like a rejection. Eric threw himself into his work as a graphic designer, taking on extra freelance projects to fill the void. His small studio apartment in Oakland became a sanctuary of sketches and late-night playlists. But even that couldn't drown out the ache. He missed Caleb, the old Caleb, who'd drag him to dive bars and argue about the best Marvel movie until dawn. Now, every interaction felt like a test, and Eric was failing. One night, Caleb texted out of the blue, "Meet me at the pier." 9 p.m. Need to talk. Eric's heart leaped, but dread followed close behind. The San Francisco waterfront was bustling when he arrived, the air sharp with salt and the distant hum of the city. Caleb was waiting near the railing, his silhouette framed against the glittering bay. He wore a dark jacket, his hands stuffed in his pockets, and Eric's breath caught at how beautiful he looked, even in his unease. "Hey," Eric said, shoving his hands in his jeans to keep from fidgeting. "What's up?" Caleb didn't meet his eyes right away. He stared out at the water, his jaw tight. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally. "About that night. About us." Eric's pulse raced. And Caleb turned to him, his hazel eyes searching. "I don't know what I'm doing, Eric. I've spent my whole life thinking I had it all figured out. Girls, career, the whole picket fence dream. But then he broke off, his voice cracking. You mess it all up." Eric's heart twisted, a mix of hope and hurt. "I'm not trying to mess anything up," he said softly. I care about you. More than I should." Caleb's laugh was bitter. "Yeah, well, that's the problem, isn't it? I care about you too. And it's freaking terrifying." Eric stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of Caleb's body in the cool night air. "Why is it terrifying?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "It's just us. You and me." Caleb shook his head, but he didn't pull away. "It's not that simple. My family, my friends, they expect things. I've got a life planned out, Eric. And this doesn't fit." Eric's chest ached, but he refused to back down. "What about what you want?" he asked. "Not your family, not your friends. You. What do you want?" Caleb, for a moment, Caleb looked like he might bolt. But then his shoulders sagged, and he reached out, his hand brushing Eric's cheek. The touch was so gentle, so unexpected, that Eric's breath caught. "I want you," Caleb whispered, the words raw and honest. "But I don't know how to do this." Eric's heart soared, but he kept his voice calm. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'm right here." Caleb's hand lingered, his thumb tracing the line of Eric's jaw. Then, like a dam breaking, he pulled Eric into a kiss, fiercer, more desperate than the one in the pool. It was a collision of need and fear, and Eric kissed back with everything he had, his hands gripping Caleb's jacket like a lifeline. When they broke apart, panting, Caleb rested his forehead against Eric's. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the waves. "I've never felt like this before." Eric's heart ached for him, for the battle he was fighting. "It's okay to be scared," he said, "but you don't have to hide from it." "Not with me." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, the world fading away. But as they walked back to Caleb's car, reality crept in. Caleb's phone buzzed with a text from his sister, asking about his latest date with a girl named Mia. Caleb's face darkened, and Eric felt the fragile bubble of their moment burst. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said as they reached the car. "I've been seeing Mia. It's not serious, but I don't know how to stop." Eric's stomach dropped. "Do you want to stop?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Caleb hesitated, and that hesitation was a knife. "I don't know," he said finally. "I need to figure this out." "Eric, I'm not ready to be what you need me to be." Eric nodded, swallowing the hurt. "Take your time," he said, but the words tasted like ash. As Caleb drove away, leaving Eric alone under the streetlights, he felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. Time. It was all they had, and all that could tear them apart. Eric tried to move on. He told himself Caleb needed space, that pushing him would only drive him further away. But every day without him felt like a slow bleed. Eric threw himself into his art, sketching late into the night, his pencil tracing the lines of Caleb's face without his permission. The sketches piled up, Caleb laughing, Caleb swimming, Caleb's eyes soft in the moonlight. Each one was a reminder of what he couldn't have. Caleb, meanwhile, was slipping further into his old life. He posted pictures with Mia on social media, smiling at a concert, holding hands at a farmer's market. Eric tried not to look, but the images burned into his mind. Mia was pretty, with long auburn hair and a laugh that lit up the screen. She was everything Caleb's family would approve of, everything Eric wasn't. One evening, Eric's phone lit up with a call from Caleb. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sound of his voice sent Eric's heart into overdrive. "Can you meet me?" Caleb asked, his voice thick with something Eric couldn't place. "I'm at the park near your place." Eric was there in 10 minutes, his sneakers pounding the pavement. The park was quiet, the swings creaking in the breeze. Caleb sat on a bench, his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. He looked tired, Bietsu, system exhausted, his eyes shadowed. Eric's chest tightened at the sight of him, but he kept his expression neutral. "What's going on?" he asked, sitting beside Caleb, careful to keep some distance. Caleb didn't look up right away. "I broke up with Mia," he said finally, his voice low. "Told her I wasn't ready for anything serious. But that's not why I'm here." Eric's heart pounded. "Then why?" Caleb lifted his head, his hazel eyes meeting Eric's with an intensity that stole his breath. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, the words raw and unpolished. "Every time I'm with her, it's you I see. It's you I want." Eric's world tilted. He dreamed of hearing those words, but now they came with a weight he hadn't expected. "Caleb," he started, but Caleb cut him off. "I'm not saying I have it all figured out," Caleb said, his voice urgent. "I don't. But I know I can't keep pretending this. Us isn't real. I'm done running from it." Eric's throat tightened. He wanted to believe him, to trust that this was real. But the fear was still there, sharp and unrelenting. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb reached for his hand, his touch warm and steady. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try. With you." Eric's heart soared, but doubt lingered. Caleb was still figuring himself out, still navigating a world he'd never planned to enter. Eric knew this wouldn't be easy for either of them. But as Caleb's fingers intertwined with his, Eric felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way. They sat there until the air grew chilly, talking about everything, fears, dreams, the messy beauty of what they were starting. Caleb's hand never left his, and for the first time, Eric felt like they were on the same page, even if the story was still unwritten. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tentative steps and quiet revelations. Eric and Caleb started spending more time together, not as friends, but as something undefined, something fragile and new. They didn't put a label on it. Eric was too afraid to push, and Caleb seemed content to let things unfold naturally. They'd meet for late-night walks along the Embarcadero, share takeout in Eric's apartment, and steal kisses in the shadows of Golden Gate Park. Each moment felt like a gift, but Eric couldn't shake the fear that it was temporary, that Caleb might wake up one day and decide this wasn't his truth. Caleb was trying, though. He opened up about his fears, his family's expectations, the pressure to fit into a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. His parents were traditional, rooted in a world where Caleb was the golden son destined for a predictable future. Coming out, even to himself, was a seismic shift. Eric listened, his heart aching for the man he loved, knowing how hard it was to rewrite your own story. One night, they drove to a quiet beach just south of Half Moon Bay. The stars were bright, the waves a steady rhythm against the shore. Caleb had been quieter than usual, and Eric braced himself for bad news. Instead, Caleb took his hand and led him to the water's edge. "I told my sister," he said, his voice steady but soft. "About us." Eric's breath caught. "What did she say?" Caleb's smile was small but genuine. "She was surprised, but she said she just wants me to be happy. She wants to meet you. Properly. I mean," Eric's eyes stung, and he looked away, letting the sound of the waves anchor him. It wasn't acceptance from Caleb's whole family, but it was a start. A big one. He squeezed Caleb's hand, his voice thick. "That means a lot." Caleb pulled him close, his arms wrapping around Eric's waist. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," he murmured, his lips brushing Eric's temple. "But I'm in this. For real." Eric's heart swelled, and he tilted his head up, kissing Caleb with a tenderness that felt like a promise. They stayed there for hours, wrapped in each other, the ocean bearing witness to a love that was finally taking root. But life wasn't a fairy tale. A few days later, Caleb's father called him home for a family dinner. Eric wasn't invited, not yet, but Caleb promised to tell his parents about them. Eric spent the evening pacing his apartment, his phone silent. When Caleb finally called, his voice was heavy. "I didn't take it well," he said. "Daddy said some things. Mom just cried." Eric's stomach twisted. He wanted to be there, to hold Caleb through the fallout. But Caleb needed space to process. "I'm here," Eric said, the words feeling inadequate. "Whenever you need me." "I know," Caleb said, and the warmth in his voice was enough to keep Eric's hope alive. "I just need a little time." Eric nodded, even though Caleb couldn't see him. "Take all the time you need," he said, and he meant it. But as he hung up, the silence in his apartment felt heavier than ever. Months later, Eric stood in the backyard where it all began, the pool shimmering under the same starry sky. This time, Caleb was beside him, his hand warm in Eric's. Their fingers laced together like they'd done this 1,000 times. They hadn't, not yet, but they were getting there. Caleb had moved out of his parents' house, renting a small place in the city to be closer to Eric. His relationship with his family was strained, but his sister had become their biggest ally, inviting them both to her birthday dinner and introducing Eric as Caleb's boyfriend with a grin that made Eric's heart soar. The journey hadn't been easy. Caleb had spent months wrestling with his identity, attending therapy and joining a local support group for queer men. Eric had been there through it all, offering quiet strength when Caleb doubted himself, celebrating the small victories, like the first time Caleb called himself bisexual without flinching. Eric, too, had grown, learning to trust that Caleb's love was real, that this wasn't a phase or a mistake. Tonight, they were hosting a small gathering, friends, Caleb's sister, a few colleagues who'd become family. The air was filled with laughter, the clink of glasses, and the soft hum of music. Eric caught Caleb's eye across the yard, and the smile they shared was a language of its own. Caleb crossed the grass, pulling Eric into a slow dance under the string lights, their bodies swaying to a song only they could hear. "You know," Caleb said, his voice low, "that night in the pool I was so scared. But I'm not anymore." Eric's chest tightened, his eyes locked on Caleb's. Yeah, Caleb said, his hazel eyes bright with certainty. "I love you, Eric. And I'm proud to be here, with you." Eric's breath hitched, and he pulled Caleb into a kiss. Soft and sure, the kind of kiss that held a future. The crowd around them cheered, and Eric laughed against Caleb's lips, his heart full. They weren't perfect, and the world wasn't always kind. But they had each other, and that was enough. As the night wound down, Eric looked around at the friends who'd become family, at Caleb, who'd rewritten his story to include him. The pool still glowed, a silent witness to the moment that changed everything. And as Eric leaned into Caleb's side, he knew they'd write the rest of their story together, one brave, beautiful step at a time.